Hello, everyone. Thank you for checking out my YouTube channel today, The Study of Antiquity and the Middle Ages. As always, I am your host, Nick Barksdale, and today we are joined by a very special guest. Many of you are going to take one look. You know who he is. You've read his books. You've watched his lectures. You've listened to him. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Dr. Cline.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
You mentioned wondering what you were standing on top of, over 5,000 years of history. Let's actually talk about that history. Could you basically take us through, even briefly, the history of Megiddo in the ancient world?
Sure, absolutely. Good thing you said briefly. Otherwise, we'd be here 5, 6, 7 hours. But yeah, let's see if I can put it in a nutshell. So there are 20 cities, one on top of another, buried inside the mound of Megiddo. The name for Megiddo, Tel El Mutasalim in modern terms. It's basically the hill of the governor. We don't know which governor, but it is ancient Megiddo. And in fact, the name Megiddo is what gave rise to Armageddon. So Har Megiddo in Hebrew means the mound or mountain of Megiddo. And so from Har Megiddo, you Armageddon, then from there you get Armageddon, and that's where we get it. So there was the H over time dropped out. It's just a little breathing mark at the front of the word, and some monk in the Middle Ages probably forgot to put the little apostrophe there. So Har Megiddo became Harmageddon and then Armageddon. So lots of battles fought there, lots of history. There, as I mentioned, 20 cities, one on top of another. The excavators, and there have been 4 teams there, again, as I mentioned, they have labeled them 1 through 20 in Roman numerals. The earliest one's actually at the bottom. Stratum 20 is the very bottom one, which is Neolithic period. It's about 5,000 BC, and that is built right on top of bedrock. And then the most recent one, Stratum 1, is the Persian period, beginning of the Greek period. It looks like the mound is abandoned just before Alexander the Great marches past it. So he would have gone by in about 332 BC, somewhere like that. And by that point, the mound has been abandoned. We don't know why. I presume maybe the water source gave out, at least temporarily. But still, that means that we've got Neolithic, we've got Chalcolithic, Copper Age, we've got Bronze Age, we've got Iron Age. So we've got Canaanites, Israelites, we've got Neo-Assyrians there, Neo-Babylonians, Persians, and then just as the Greeks are getting there, it gets abandoned. But that doesn't mean that habitation ends. It just moves off the mound because the Romans are there as well. And in fact, they build a legionnaires camp, and one of the legions is stationed there. Matt Adams and Yotam Tepper and others are now excavating that Roman fort, which you can see from the top of Megiddo. Looking down, it's in one of the fields next to it. So the Romans are there as well. And in fact, there was another little town nearby, which is right now underneath the current prison. There's a modern day prison at the crossroads at Megiddo Junction. And when they were digging to put up a new building about 10 years ago, they found a house from that village, which is somewhere 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries AD. And in the house was a mosaic. And in the mosaic was inscribed to the Lord Jesus Christ. So it's like one of the first times, I believe it's the earliest mosaic in which Jesus is mentioned. So there is some dispute as to the actual date. Like I say, it's somewhere between 3rd and 5th centuries AD. So even though habitation on the mound ceases, they're still living around it. The ruling center of the Jezreel Valley moves down the valley to Mount Tabor, where the Transfiguration takes place. And there's actually 3 churches up on top of there. So anyway, lots of history there. As I used to tell my students when I took them with us on the dig, there's pretty much something here for everybody, and especially if you're into battles. So if you want to do battlefield archaeology, there's been at least 34 battles that have been fought at Megiddo or nearby.
We call it Armageddon, but yet for so many, it truly was the end. So many people, empires have fallen around it. I mean, it's truly the center, really the beginnings and ends of so many civilizations and peoples.
It absolutely is. I mean, Megiddo was so central because it controlled the Jezreel Valley, which is the Via Maris, the way of the sea goes right through it. So if you wanted to control that region, you had to control the valley. If you wanted to control the valley, you had to control Megiddo. So every invader who came through fought a battle at Megiddo. We've got all sorts of them. That's the Battles of Armageddon book that I put out about 20 years ago, has all of those battles. Only Alexander the Great didn't fight, and that was because the area actually gave in to him without a fight, plus the site was abandoned by that point. But Tutmosis III, who fought the first battle that we know of there, he said in one inscription that the capturing of Megiddo is like the capturing of 1,000 cities. And he was right. He was right.
That actually takes me to my very next set of questions. And this is coming from a really good friend of mine. I've known this guy for a long time. He's a fellow history fanatic. He is actually representing the Historical African Martial Arts Association, in which they really dive into ancient fighting styles, especially like in ancient Egypt and Kush and stuff like that. And so he actually raised some really awesome questions involving Egyptian conquest in the area, and especially when dealing with rebellious Canaanite vassals. What do we actually know about the conflict that has become known as the Battle of Megiddo?
We actually know a lot about it because Tutmosis III leaves us a written record of it. So it's frequently referred to as the first battle fought in history. Of course, it's not the first battle that was fought. That's when, two Neolithic guys threw rocks at each other. But this is the first time when it's actually written down. And it looks like the scribe took the daybooks from the campaign itself and then wrote up an abbreviated version and put it up on the walls of some of the temples down in Egypt. So we actually know that when Tutmosis III came to the throne, he was the stepson and nephew of Hatshepsut, the famous female pharaoh. When he comes to the throne, dates debated. I usually say it's 1479 BC. All of the vassal rulers up in Canaan, who had been under the thumb of Egypt, they rose up in rebellion. If you're going to rebel against somebody, the first year of their rule is probably a good time to do it. So he tells us that about 30 rulers rose up in rebellion. He had to march up there to put down the rebellion, and he says that they got up to the little town of Yechem, where they stopped and they had a war council, because there were three ways to get to Megiddo. You could go the central way, which was the fastest, but it was also the most narrow. That is today the Nahal Iron, the Wadi, the, Mishmar. There's a number of different names for it, but it's the central pass. So his generals all said, please don't do that. We're going to be ambushed. And they said, there's two other ways to get to Megiddo. One's around to the north and one's down to the south. They're both a bit longer, but we won't be ambushed because it's wider. And Tutmosis III said, yeah, but you know what? The Canaanites know that. And they're not going to think that I'm that stupid to come up the middle. But you know what? I am that stupid. And so he did go up the middle, and sure enough, he was right. The Canaanites were waiting at the entrances to the north and the south, but not the middle. So he made it through completely uncontested and won the battle. But he made a couple of mistakes, including he stopped to let his soldiers loot and pillage all the little camps that were around Megiddo that the rebellious princes had brought there. And that allowed the people inside Megiddo to close the city gates. And he had to spend somewhere between 1 and 7 months besieging it until he could actually take it. So I tell my students that if you're going to capture a city, actually capture it before you stop to loot and plunder, because if you do it the other way, it doesn't quite work. So it was very successful. We know all about this because he did leave this inscription. And in fact, Lord Allenby, when Edmund Allenby came through in 1918, he fought a battle there in World War One and was able to take that inscription and repeat the same tactics. So September 1918, Allenby did exactly the same thing 3,400 years later with exactly the same results. He won the battle. No men were killed that came up through the Central Pass, and the Turkish army and Germans that were there were not expecting it. Rather, the Ottoman army and the Germans, they weren't expecting it, and he won. So, the famous saying that George Santayana supposedly said, those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it. I would actually change it and say, those who do study history can repeat it if they want to, because Allenby was able to do that with T3, as I call them. So yeah, we know a lot about that first battle because it was written down.
That is fantastic. And I would guarantee that Allenby did not stop to let his men loot, right?
He did not stay, quite right. He didn't stop. But that's also how they came to start digging at Megiddo in the 1920s, because when James Henry Breasted, who had just founded the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, 1920, he was exploring the region, trying to figure out where to have a dig, and met up with Allenby. This is just after World War One, and he said, to Allenby, he said, "How did you know to repeat the tactics of Tutmosis III?" And Allenby said, "Well, the books that you published in 1906, Ancient Records of Egypt?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "I had looked in those and I read the account of Tutmosis III's battle, so I followed it. So you are the reason I was able to do this." So in fact, he said to Breasted, Allenby says, "If you're looking for a site to dig, why don't you dig at Megiddo? Why don't you dig at Armageddon?" And Breasted said, "That's a great idea." And that's how the excavation was born. So, everything leads to everything else.
I have quite a bit of Breasted's work here as well. I honestly can't recommend him enough. Him and so many others, from Rawlinson to Mommsen to Breasted, they're so vital when studying ancient history and even historiography on its own. And I mean, I can't recommend them enough. As a matter of fact, to my subscribers, if you go to internetarchive.org, you can actually access a lot of their awesome materials online. Mm-hmm. And I can't recommend it enough.
Yeah, knowing what the early explorers, the early archaeologists did is absolutely fascinating. And this Digging Up Armageddon book that I just came out with, Breasted figures very prominently in it because he was micromanaging the entire dig from Chicago for 14 or so years. And reading the letters that he wrote back and forth, wow, he was a pretty brutal dictator of a director, if I can put it that way. So yeah, it was interesting.
Yeah, the back and forth that you talk about, with these telegraphs, just going back and forth from this guy reporting on this guy, or secretly informing, or just flat out trash talk, is right. Absolutely, one, they're really funny, but it's also very interesting. And that's one thing I really enjoyed about the book, is just the intensity and the drama as everyone's trying to, explore one of the greatest sites in human history. And so it's so great.
Yeah, at the same time as they're trying to live with each other, because when we go digging now, like when we dug at Megiddo, it's every other summer for 6 or 7 weeks. They were at Megiddo 24/7 for months at a time. In fact, at one point, they would be there digging for 9 months and then take 3 months off. Later, it was more like 6 months on, 6 months off. But, the team was never more than a dozen people at most, and sometimes half that, living in the same house. So if you can imagine being together with a group like that, working and living together, the tensions, it was sometimes more like a soap opera than anything else. So I do think this would make an amazing, like a mini series. Oh boy, the interpersonal relationships were just absolutely amazing.
That's actually that's a brilliant point. Whether it's HBO or BBC or PBS, somebody should do a docudrama for sure. That'd be fantastic. Maybe
Yeah.
even the History Channel. That way they could talk about real history for a change. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You could totally, like I do in the book, you could intersperse the archaeology with the archaeologists and have two narrative threads or arcs going through it. Absolutely.
That'd be fantastic. And if we're lucky, you could be there throughout the entire series, guiding us through it. So,
Oh, that would be so much fun to be a consultant on that. Absolutely.
and so, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for kicking back and enjoying this awesome interview with Dr. Cline, who is, in my opinion, one of the real rock stars when it comes to archaeology and history. And I honestly can't get enough of his work. Dr. Cline, thank you so much for coming on today.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for your kind words. And thank you to all your listeners for listening in. But I want to thank you. Speaking of rock stars, you yourself are a rock star. Thank you so much for bringing all of this to the general public. There's a lot of people out there that are interested. They don't know where to go. And you and your series are doing a marvelous job and a great favor by bringing all of this to the public. So on behalf of myself and all of my colleagues, thank you for everything that you're doing.
Honestly, it's a pleasure. People like you are the reason I do what I do. Y'all literally provided the inspiration for me, and honestly, it all goes back to you all. Thank you so much as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, don't forget to check out the links in the video description below, where you can also acquire Digging Up Armageddon, the search for the lost city of Solomon by none other than Dr. Eric Cline. It is a fantastic book that takes you through not just the history of Megiddo, but the history of those who brought it to our understanding, who guided us through it, who excavated it, the hardships and drama that they endured, and the fascinating stories of the men and women who shaped archaeology of their day. It comes in a book format. You can get it on Kindle, but also what is absolutely fantastic is if you get and download the audiobook, you get to listen to Dr. Eric Cline himself take you through his awesome work. And I can't recommend it enough.